In a world where trust is easily shattered, and accusations can ruin lives in an instant, one man's fight for justice proves that truth has a way of rising to the surface. Imagine being accused of something you didn't do, something so serious, it could cost you everything. Now, imagine being trapped in a system where your word means nothing and the whole world seems to turn its back on you. This is the story of a man who was falsely accused of a crime he didn't commit, a man who went from being an innocent bystander to a suspect in the blink of an eye. It all started on an ordinary afternoon, in what seemed like an ordinary place. A busy neighborhood, full of people going about their day. But when an incident occurred, a theft in a local store, the entire narrative changed. The scene was chaotic, a mix of confusion, disbelief, and desperation. And in that moment, the police made a decision that would alter the course of one man's life forever. They pointed at him. No evidence. No witnesses. Just suspicion. What followed was a nightmare. A simple accusation escalated quickly. His name was plastered all over the news, his face a symbol of shame. People who knew him were divided. Some believed the worst, others stood by him, but that didn't matter. The court of public opinion had already spoken. He was guilty in the eyes of many. And in a society where perception often outweighs reality, the truth was buried under layers of judgment and prejudice. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Rather than crumbling under the weight of these false accusations, he decided to fight back. Every day, the walls of injustice closed in tighter, but he refused to give up. He gathered evidence, reached out to anyone who would listen, and slowly but surely began to unravel the web of lies that had been spun around him. But the road to redemption was not easy. It was filled with setbacks, frustration, and moments when he thought it would never end. Yet, each time he faced an obstacle, he pushed forward. What happened next is something few would have believed if they hadn't seen it for themselves. The journey from being wrongly accused to proving his innocence was nothing short of extraordinary. It wasn't just about clearing his name, it was about reclaiming his life, his dignity, and his future. Every step was a fight, every moment a battle. And when you think it can't get any harder, that's when the real twist comes. So, what happens next? How does he go from being the face of a wrongful accusation to becoming a symbol of resilience? The answer lies in the unbelievable steps he took to turn his situation around. But the real story isn't just about one man, it's about the lessons we can all learn from his strength, determination, and unwavering belief in justice. And as this story unfolds, you'll see just how deep the system of injustice can go, and how one person's fight can challenge everything we know about truth. But there's more to this story, more twists that will leave you speechless. What's the real cost of false accusations? And who was really behind the theft in the first place? The answers are just around the corner, and trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. Stay tuned for the incredible, jaw-dropping continuation of this unbelievable comeback. Days after the initial accusation, the pressure on him intensified. People who once smiled at him in passing now avoided eye contact. His friends seemed uncertain, not knowing what to believe, and his family, though supportive, was on edge. The damage to his reputation was done, and every attempt to clear his name felt like hitting a wall. The whispers followed him everywhere, and even in his quiet moments, the looming cloud of suspicion hung heavy in the air. But amidst it all, something inside him refused to break. He couldn't explain it, but he felt this deep, burning need to prove not just his innocence, but the strength of his character. He had to show the world that being wrongly accused doesn't mean you're defined by the label someone else puts on you. In the days following the incident, the local news had exploded with stories about the theft. It was the kind of thing that made headlines, an unexpected crime in an otherwise peaceful neighborhood. But as the narrative began to develop, there was one small detail that no one seemed to question. The man who was accused of the crime, he hadn't even been near the store when it happened. He was miles away, on the other side of town, at a completely different location. But that didn't matter. The witnesses had said they'd seen him. The security footage blurry as it was seemed to match his description. And in that moment, that was enough to seal his fate. No one cared about his alibi. No one seemed interested in the truth. It all started with the store's security cameras. The footage showed a man entering the store and making his way toward the electronics section. The image was grainy, but the general shape, height, and even the clothing appeared to match him. That's all it took. A piece of shaky footage, a single witness statement, and suddenly, he was the one on trial. But there were cracks in the story. Small, almost unnoticed details that didn't fit. The camera angles didn't fully capture the suspect's face. The timestamp didn't align with his known whereabouts. But no one cared to dig deeper. His world was being torn apart, and all anyone could see was the narrative being sold to them. At first, he tried to reason with the authorities. He explained where he had been, who he had been with, and what he had been doing. He had receipts, phone records, even a few people who could vouch for him. But none of that mattered. The system wasn't designed to listen to someone like him. They weren't interested in the facts, they were interested in the quick resolution of a case. And when the evidence didn't point to anyone else, they focused all their attention on him. It was the easy choice, the comfortable choice. Desperation set in. He was faced with the impossible choice of how to prove his innocence in a world that seemed bent on believing the worst. The weight of his situation bore down on him, and every new accusation felt like a blow to his soul. Yet he knew that he couldn't stop fighting. The false accusations had already begun to ruin his life, but they hadn't stolen his spirit. Not yet. Then came the first break in the case. A former employee of the store, someone who had worked in the security room, reached out. They had seen something strange that no one else had noticed: a discrepancy in the footage. It wasn't much, just a few seconds here and there, but it was enough to make him think. The former employee explained that the footage had been tampered with. The timeline didn't match up with the actual time the theft had occurred. Whoever had done this had covered their tracks just enough to make the evidence seem real. He was being framed, and someone was behind it all. The question now wasn't just how to clear his name, it was who would go to such lengths to destroy him. As he began to dig deeper into the case, something unsettling became clear: this wasn't an isolated incident. He wasn't the first person to be wrongly accused, and he wouldn't be the last. In fact, it seemed like the theft had been part of a much larger scheme, something far more sinister than just a crime of opportunity. But the deeper he looked, the more dangerous things became. Whoever was behind the plot had influence. They had control. They could make people disappear, silence those who questioned their power, and distort the truth to their advantage. They had already done it once. And they weren't going to stop just because one person decided to fight back. So he continued his investigation, taking risks, speaking to people who might have the answers he needed, even though he knew it could lead to more danger. He knew that with each step forward, he was drawing closer to a truth that could change everything. But the closer he got, the more the walls seemed to close in around him. He couldn't trust anyone, not even those who had been on his side. He started to feel like he was living in a world where nothing was as it seemed, and the truth was the most dangerous thing of all. What he didn't realize yet was that the real struggle wasn't going to be against the people who framed him, but against a system that would rather protect its own than admit when it's wrong. It wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about facing the corruption, the hidden agendas, and the manipulation that lay beneath the surface of everything he thought he knew. In a quiet moment, alone in his apartment, he realized something: this fight wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the people who had been through the same thing and hadn't been able to fight back. It was about everyone who had been wronged by a system that didn't care to listen, a system that would rather sweep the truth under the rug than face the ugly reality of its own mistakes. But even as he gathered more evidence, even as he found more and more contradictions in the case against him, there were still too many questions left unanswered. Who had planted the false evidence? Who had created the illusion of his guilt? And most importantly, why him? It was a puzzle with more pieces than he knew how to fit together. Yet he couldn't stop. He couldn't give up. Because in the end, this wasn't just about proving his innocence, it was about showing the world that justice could still prevail, even when everything seemed to be stacked against you. But the deeper he went, the more dangerous things became. The system wasn't going to let him tear down its walls without a fight. As he prepared for what would come next, he had no idea how far this battle would take him. Would he find the answers he was looking for? Would the truth finally come to light? Or would the forces behind his false accusation prove to be more powerful than he could ever have imagined? The answers were just out of reach, and with each passing day, the stakes grew higher. The clock was ticking. And soon, he would find himself standing at the edge of something far bigger than he ever anticipated. Stay tuned, because the next part of this story will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about justice, truth, and the fight for what's right. The more he uncovered, the more it became apparent that the situation was far more complex than he had initially thought. His fight for justice was no longer just about clearing his name, it was about confronting a system so deeply flawed that it almost seemed like a battle against the very fabric of society. The corruption, the lies, the hidden agendas, it was all connected in ways he couldn't yet understand, but the pieces were beginning to fall into place. The false accusation had fractured his life, but it also gave him something he hadn't anticipated: clarity. For the first time in years, he could see the truth not just about what had happened to him, but about the world around him. People didn't just get wrongly accused of theft by mistake. Someone had orchestrated this, carefully crafting a narrative that painted him as the perfect criminal. The more he thought about it, the more certain he became that this was personal. Someone wanted him out of the way. But why? That was the question that lingered in his mind. He had always been an ordinary person, with no history of conflict or trouble. But as he began to dig deeper, he started to uncover something troubling: a network of individuals, all with ties to the local law enforcement and the businesses around town, who had a lot to lose if certain secrets came to light. There were whispers of a larger operation, one involving illegal activity, money laundering, and shady deals between big corporations and corrupt officials. And somehow, he had unknowingly found himself in the crosshairs of it all. It was hard to know who he could trust anymore. The people who had once supported him seemed increasingly distant, as if they, too, were beginning to fear the truth. One night, a friend of his from work, someone he had known for years, sent him a cryptic message. "Stay out of this. It's bigger than you think," it said. He didn't know whether to be relieved that someone else was aware of the danger or terrified that they were warning him to stop. Either way, it didn't change the fact that he couldn't walk away. If he did, the lie would become the truth, and he would be nothing more than a footnote in a story of injustice. At the same time, the pressure from the authorities grew. It was clear that the police weren't interested in finding the real culprit, they were only concerned with closing the case. His interactions with them had become increasingly tense. They asked the same questions over and over, never allowing him the chance to explain himself properly. They were relentless, almost as if they were trying to break him down, make him crack under pressure. But he couldn't afford to give in. Not now. Days turned into weeks, and the search for answers led him into more dangerous territory. He had a gut feeling that someone in the local police department was involved in the conspiracy against him. But he couldn't prove it. Every attempt to investigate brought him closer to a world he wasn't prepared for, one where power, manipulation, and money shaped everything. The deeper he went, the more threatening the encounters became. He started receiving anonymous messages, threats disguised as warnings. His car was tampered with. His phone line was bugged. But these acts of intimidation only fueled his determination. He knew now that he wasn't just fighting to clear his name. He was fighting to expose something far darker, something that could shake the foundations of everything he once believed in. One evening, while he was going through old police reports and court documents, he came across something that stopped him cold. It was a name he recognized. It was tied to an unsolved robbery from years ago, a case that had been swept under the rug. At first, it seemed like a coincidence, but the more he looked into it, the more it became clear that this wasn't random. The same people who had been involved in the theft that had ruined his life were connected to the robbery. And then, he found something even more chilling. The man who had been accused of that robbery had disappeared without a trace, never to be seen again. That's when it hit him: this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about a cover-up so deep that anyone who got too close to the truth ended up lost, just like the others before him. His next move was dangerous. He reached out to someone on the inside, a former detective who had been dismissed from the force under questionable circumstances. The detective had a reputation for getting too close to sensitive cases, and his career had been destroyed as a result. But now, years later, he had a different perspective, a perspective that came from the shadows. He agreed to meet in a secluded spot, away from prying eyes. The conversation was tense, every word weighed down with the gravity of what they were about to discuss. The detective's information was both shocking and sobering. He confirmed what the man had already suspected: there was a network operating right under their noses, one that extended far beyond the small town where everything had started. They were a group of people who had managed to stay one step ahead of the law, hiding in plain sight. And every time someone got too close to exposing them, the system was manipulated to protect them. It wasn't just about money. It was about control. And if he was going to get to the bottom of it, he needed to take on a force far more powerful than he could have ever imagined. But with the detective's warning still fresh in his mind, he began to question whether it was even possible to expose the truth without losing everything. The more he learned, the more dangerous the stakes became. The deeper he went, the more enemies he made. The question he kept asking himself was, how far was he willing to go to expose the truth? And at what cost? Meanwhile, the public narrative around the case continued to shift. The media, which had once been so quick to paint him as the villain, began to take notice of his efforts. They weren't interested in his innocence, but they were interested in the story. The accusations against him had become a spectacle, a piece of drama for the public to consume. And while some reporters were beginning to question the official narrative, others saw him as just another pawn in the game, a story that could be exploited for ratings, no matter what the truth was. Through it all, his resolve remained unbroken. He knew that the fight was far from over, but he also knew that with each piece of evidence he uncovered, with each new connection he made, the walls of secrecy were beginning to crack. But who could he trust? Who was really on his side? And what would happen when the truth finally came to light? The next few days would bring him closer to answers, but also closer to danger. And in the end, he would have to decide whether he was willing to risk it all or walk away from a battle that could destroy him. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, but the real question was, would the truth ever be enough to overcome the power standing in his way? As the tension continued to build, he knew the time was fast approaching for a decision that would change everything. But for now, the mystery remained unsolved, and the stakes had never been higher. The closer he got to the truth, the more dangerous things became. Every lead he followed seemed to pull him deeper into a web of deception that was far more tangled than he had ever anticipated. With each new revelation, he could feel the walls closing in on him. Forces far beyond his control were at work now. The more he uncovered, the more people seemed to vanish, or worse, turn against him. Those he thought he could trust were nowhere to be found, and every moment of progress only seemed to bring more threats, more danger. The anonymous warnings kept coming. Letters slipped under his door, cryptic messages left on his phone, and strange, shadowy figures lurking just out of sight. It was clear someone was watching him, waiting for him to slip up. But he couldn't stop. He couldn't let fear control him now. Not after everything he had fought for. The stakes had gone beyond his own life. He was now fighting to expose a system of corruption so deep, it had destroyed countless lives without a second thought. But with every piece of evidence he found, it felt like someone was always one step ahead of him. It was maddening, like trying to catch smoke with bare hands. He had dug through police records, uncovered financial documents tied to the stolen goods, and even traced the flow of money between shadowy businesses. But each time he thought he was getting closer to unraveling the truth, the threads would slip away, leaving him with more questions and fewer answers. The night he finally felt like he was on the verge of a breakthrough, something happened that changed everything. It was late, and he was alone in his apartment, sifting through the final pieces of a puzzle that had taken weeks to assemble. His heart raced as he connected the dots. He was closer than ever before to uncovering who was behind it all. But then the power went out. The sudden darkness was like a slap to the face. He froze, his senses on high alert. The silence was deafening. And then came the knock at the door. His mind raced. Was it someone he could trust? Or was it the enemy, coming for him? There was no time to think. He moved cautiously toward the door, his hand hovering over the lock. Another knock. Louder this time. He hesitated, the tension thick in the air, before finally opening it. There was no one there. He stepped out into the hallway, looking both ways. Nothing. The apartment complex was eerily quiet. He knew he couldn't afford to let his guard down. Whoever was behind all of this had never played fair, and now, it seemed like they were closing in. Suddenly, his phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking the silence. It was an encrypted message from the detective he had been working with. Meet me at the old warehouse at dawn. I have everything. Don't trust anyone else. The message was short, but it was clear this was his chance to finally get the answers he had been desperately searching for. But he also knew that meeting someone in the dark, at an abandoned location, could be a trap. It could be the end of everything. Still, there was no choice. He had to go. He wasn't just going to let the truth slip through his fingers now. He grabbed his jacket and left the apartment, his mind racing with the possibilities. As he made his way through the streets, every sound seemed amplified, his footsteps echoing off the pavement, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, the distant hum of traffic. It all felt so surreal, like he was walking in a dream, but with the unmistakable sense that something terrible was lurking just behind him. The warehouse loomed ahead, its silhouette dark against the fading sky. It was a cold, abandoned place, filled with the remnants of old machinery and broken windows. The perfect spot for a meeting or a trap. As he stepped inside, the stale air hit him, and he could feel the weight of the darkness surrounding him. He was deep in enemy territory now, but there was no turning back. His heart pounded in his chest as he moved deeper into the building, his eyes scanning the shadows. He felt the presence of someone else before he saw them. A figure stepped into view, shrouded in darkness, but there was something familiar about their silhouette. It was the detective. He took a step forward, relief flooding through him, but the detective held up a hand, signaling him to stop. It's not safe here. We don't have much time. His voice was low, urgent. What's going on? He asked, his voice shaking with tension. The detective looked around, his eyes darting nervously. I've been digging into the case more than I should have. I uncovered something you're not going to like. The people behind this, they're not just local. They have connections in high places, powerful people who will do anything to keep their secrets hidden. The deeper we go, the more dangerous it gets. His heart sank. He had known it was bad, but he hadn't expected it to be this deep. The detective continued, his voice low, barely a whisper. The theft, the framing, the cover-ups, it's all part of something much bigger. The people behind it are willing to do whatever it takes to stay out of the spotlight. And if they realize we're onto them, there's no telling what they'll do next. Before he could respond, there was a sudden noise behind him. The sound of footsteps, quick, purposeful, coming closer. His pulse spiked. Someone was here. And it wasn't the detective. The detective grabbed him by the arm. We need to go. Now. But it was too late. The sound of metal scraping against the floor echoed through the building, and out of the shadows emerged two figures, their faces hidden behind masks. They were too fast. Before he could even react, one of them lunged forward, knocking him to the ground. The detective was already moving, trying to reach for his weapon, but the other figure was faster, grabbing him by the wrist and twisting it. The struggle was chaotic, frantic, as both sides fought for control. But the odds were against them. And then, everything went black. When he awoke, he was alone. The detective was gone, and there was no sign of the masked figures. Only silence. But as his mind cleared, one thing became painfully obvious: they were no longer in the same place. He had been taken. And whatever came next, he knew it was going to be the most dangerous part of his journey yet. The stakes were higher than ever. He wasn't just fighting for his freedom anymore, he was fighting for his life. And for the truth. The clock was ticking. And he didn't know how much longer he had before they came for him again. When he finally regained consciousness, his head throbbed, and his vision swam in and out of focus. The air was thick, cold, and stale. He was no longer in the warehouse, but somewhere even darker, the only light coming from a flickering bulb overhead. His body ached, but there was something worse gnawing at him, his mind racing, trying to piece together what had happened in those moments before he blacked out. The detective was gone. The figures in the masks were gone. And now, he was alone in a place that felt like it was miles away from any kind of civilization. His hands were bound tightly behind his back, the ropes cutting into his skin. He tried to stay calm, but the panic crept in. He had no idea where he was, how long he had been out, or who had taken him. The walls of the room were bare, concrete, with nothing but a metal chair in the center of the floor where he was sitting. It felt like a trap, and the knot in his stomach tightened with each passing second. A door creaked open somewhere in the distance, and heavy footsteps echoed on the concrete floor. His heart skipped a beat. Someone was coming. He strained his ears, trying to make out any sounds, anything that could give him a clue about what was going on. He had no weapons, no phone, no way to call for help. All he could do was wait. The footsteps grew louder, closer. And then, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, his face partially obscured by the dim light. The air seemed to shift around him, an unsettling calm before a storm. He stopped just a few feet in front of the man, staring down at him with cold eyes. "You're not as clever as you think," the man said, his voice low and menacing. There was something familiar about him, something that sent a shiver down his spine, but he couldn't place it. "You've been poking around in places you don't belong." The man's words hit like a slap. He was aware of the danger, but hearing it spoken out loud made it all too real. The truth was no longer just something he was trying to uncover, it was something that had caught up with him, a truth that was too dangerous to be known. "I didn't steal anything," he shot back, his voice raw with desperation. "I was framed, and I'm going to prove it. This, whatever this is, it's all going to come out. You can't stop me." The man stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "Oh, but I can. You have no idea who you're dealing with. Your little investigation. It's done. You're finished." His chest tightened. He had to think, had to act, but every instinct told him he was running out of time. And then, in a moment of clarity, a horrifying thought hit him. What if this man wasn't just an enforcer, some low-level thug meant to intimidate him? What if he was someone much higher up the chain of command? What if the people behind this whole scheme were far more powerful than he could ever have imagined? Before he could speak again, the man moved even closer, kneeling down in front of him. The faint light illuminated his face just enough to reveal a scar that ran down his cheek, an old mark that seemed strangely familiar. His heart skipped a beat. "You know me," the man said, almost as if reading his thoughts. "You just don't remember." The man reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, old photograph. He held it in front of the man's face, forcing him to look at it. His breath caught in his throat. It was a picture of a younger version of himself, standing next to another man, a man he recognized, but not for the reasons he wanted to. The shock hit him like a tidal wave, and he felt his stomach drop. It was his father. But how could that be? He had never seen the man in the photograph. His father had disappeared when he was just a child, and everything he'd been told about him pointed to him being a mere shadow, a distant memory. He had no idea what had happened to him, or why he'd left. But now, here was this man, this stranger, holding a photograph of the two of them together. His mind spun, trying to process what was happening. "Your father and I were close," the man continued, his tone dark and heavy with implication. "He was involved in things you can't even imagine. And now so are you." The room seemed to spin. His father's name, once so distant and meaningless, now felt like a key to a locked door, and he was standing right in front of it. But the more he thought about it, the more terrifying it became. His father's disappearance, his life that had always seemed so ordinary, all of it was a lie. And the truth, the real truth, was something he wasn't ready for. "Your father left me in charge of making sure people like you stayed in line," the man went on, his voice cold, unfeeling. "He thought it was funny, bringing someone like you into the fold. But I've seen what happens to people who start asking too many questions. They disappear." His blood ran cold. His mind raced with questions, but there was no time to ask them. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to escape, to run, to do anything to get out of there. But he was bound, trapped in the chair, and the man was right there, holding all the answers. "You won't get away with this," he said, his voice shaking with a mix of fear and anger. The man only smiled, a cruel, knowing grin. "I already have." And just like that, the room seemed to close in on him. The walls felt like they were suffocating him, and the weight of the truth of everything he had uncovered pressed down on him like a vice. He was just a pawn in a game far larger than he had ever realized, a game where the rules had been rigged long before he had ever stepped in. The door creaked open again, and another figure stepped in, silhouetted in the doorway. He couldn't make out the face, but there was something familiar about the posture, the way they moved. It wasn't just one enemy anymore. It was more. And as the door clicked shut behind them, he knew he was running out of time. The pieces of the puzzle were scattered all around him, but the more he tried to put them together, the more he realized that the answers were just out of reach. This was bigger than him. Bigger than anything he had ever imagined. And as the figure approached, a chill ran down his spine. Was this the end? Or just another chapter in a story that was far from over? The figure in the doorway moved closer, their footsteps echoing in the silence of the room. The man who had been holding the photograph of his father didn't seem concerned, almost too calm for the situation. But the closer the new figure got, the more his gut twisted with a mix of fear and disbelief. There was something about the way the figure moved, the way they carried themselves. As they stepped into the light, the world seemed to shift. The face that emerged from the shadows was one he never expected to see again. It was a face from his past, a face he had been running from for years, the last person he thought would be involved in all of this. It was his brother. The shock was too much to process at once. His brain struggled to make sense of it. He hadn't seen his brother in over a decade, not since the family had fallen apart, since their lives had split down paths that seemed so different. The man standing before him wasn't the younger version of the boy he remembered. He was hardened, colder, his eyes carrying the weight of secrets he had clearly kept buried for far too long. You're alive?" His voice came out more like a whisper, the words feeling foreign, like he was speaking from another lifetime. He had spent years telling himself his brother was lost, gone, just another casualty of the world that had torn their family apart. But here he was, standing in front of him, as if nothing had changed. His brother's expression remained unreadable, and for a moment, it felt like time stood still. "I'm alive," he said flatly, "and I'm exactly where I've always been." The words sent a chill down his spine. They didn't make sense. How could this man, the one he had always thought of as the one who disappeared, be here now, involved in everything he had uncovered? You were part of this?" His voice cracked, the enormity of the betrayal hitting him all at once. It wasn't just the theft, the lies, the cover-ups. It was the realization that his own family, his own flesh and blood had been tangled in it all from the very beginning. His brother didn't flinch, didn't show any sign of remorse. "It was always about survival," he said coldly. "You wouldn't understand." Survival. The word stung. He had spent so much of his life trying to piece together the story, to find justice for the wrongs that had been done to him, to his family. But now, in this dimly lit room, the truth seemed more complex than he could have ever imagined. His brother, the person who was supposed to have his back, had been one of the people pulling the strings from the start. And that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the realization that the scheme wasn't just about him or his family, it was about something far larger. His brother's role in the entire operation was not just as a participant. He had been the mastermind. He had been orchestrating everything from the shadows, guiding the movements of others, pulling the strings to make sure everything played out in a way that would benefit him, and only him. Why? The question slipped out before he could stop it. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you?" His brother's gaze softened just for a moment. But it wasn't sympathy. It was almost like regret, the kind that came too late. "You weren't supposed to know. You were always the one who asked too many questions. Always the one who wouldn't let things go. And now, look where that's got you." The finality of those words hit like a punch to the gut. Everything he had thought he knew, everything he had fought for, now felt like a cruel illusion. It wasn't just a mistake, or a random series of events. His entire existence, his search for truth, had been manipulated from the very start. But there was no time to dwell on it. The walls seemed to close in, the room growing smaller with every passing second. He could feel the anger bubbling up inside him, the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He couldn't just sit there, couldn't let his brother, his own flesh and blood, get away with this. "I'm not done," he said through gritted teeth. His voice low but filled with determination. "This is far from over." Before his brother could respond, there was a loud crash from the far side of the room. The door slammed open, and several more figures flooded into the space, armed, masked, and ready for whatever came next. They weren't just here to threaten him now. This was it. This was the moment where the entire plan was about to come crashing down. The tension in the room was suffocating. But then, in an instant, everything changed. His brother stepped back, a strange look crossing his face, something like fear, something he couldn't quite place. "Get him out of here," he barked at the masked figures, but the command was met with confusion, and then hesitation. "What do you mean, out of here?" one of them asked, lowering their weapon, clearly unsure. "You heard me. Get him out, his brother snapped again, his voice tinged with something darker, more urgent. There was a brief, awkward silence before one of the masked figures finally stepped forward, lifting their gun, but something in their posture suggested uncertainty. The standoff felt like it was about to erupt. But then, the unthinkable happened. The figure holding the gun dropped it to the floor with a loud clatter, and pulled off their mask. It was the detective. The same detective who had seemed to be on his side. The same detective who had disappeared when things started getting too close. But now, here he was, standing among his brother's men, a traitor, his face revealing a cold smirk. Surprised? The detective said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Did you think it was all just a coincidence? The realization hit like a thunderclap. The detective hadn't been trying to help him. He had been working for his brother all along. The entire investigation, everything that had seemed like progress, had been nothing more than a diversion to keep him chasing shadows. With that revelation, everything clicked into place, and yet, nothing made sense. The lies, the betrayals, the people he thought he could trust, it was all part of a bigger game, a game he was now losing. His brother's cold laugh echoed in the room, and for a moment, it felt like the world was closing in around him. But then, just as the detective stepped forward, preparing to make his final move, there was another voice, one that sent a chill down everyone's spine. You're not getting away with this. The voice came from behind him, and when he turned, he saw someone he never thought he'd see again. It was someone from his past, someone who had been a ghost, a forgotten memory. But they were here now, standing in the doorway, holding a gun aimed squarely at the detective's chest. His heart skipped a beat. The final twist had arrived, and everything was about to change. The room was frozen in time, a chaotic standstill where everyone was waiting for someone to make the first move. The detective, still holding his smirk, didn't flinch as the gun aimed at him from across the room. But when the figure stepped forward, the familiar weight of their presence hit him like a wave. It was someone who knew too much, someone from his past he never expected to see again. And their words, their simple declaration, shook everything to its core. You're not getting away with this. The detective's eyes widened for just a fraction of a second, but that was enough. The man who had once been his ally, who had played both sides, moving in and out of shadows, now found himself exposed. And in that moment, the power balance in the room shifted. The woman holding the gun wasn't some random bystander. She wasn't just a pawn in this game of betrayal and lies. She was someone from the deepest corners of his life, someone he had long buried in his past, his mother. She was the last person he had ever expected to come to his rescue. After everything, after all the years of silence, of wondering whether she was still alive, here she was standing tall, unwavering, and aiming her weapon straight at the detective's chest. The man who had orchestrated so much of the pain, the confusion, and the manipulation in their lives. The man who had tried to keep them all trapped in a web of lies, kept them all running in circles. His mother's appearance turned the tide. She had been the one to teach him to think critically, to never accept things as they were presented. Growing up, she had always been there, just out of reach, with warnings, wisdom, and lessons that would become more valuable than he could ever have known. But she had vanished, disappeared into the ether, as if she had never existed. Until now. And in that moment, everything made sense. The secrets, the half-truths, the lies, she had been one step ahead all along. You don't know what you're dealing with, the detective said, his voice faltering for the first time since entering the room. There was an edge of fear that crept into his tone. You think you can just walk in here and stop me? His mother didn't flinch. You have no idea what I'm capable of. Her words were calm, deliberate, but they carried the weight of years of pent-up strength. She had lived through things most people could never imagine, and that was something the detective, the brother, and all the players in this twisted game had failed to understand. They had underestimated her. And now, as the gun aimed unwaveringly at the detective, they were going to feel the consequences of their actions. The silence stretched, thick and unbearable, as the detective weighed his options. He was a man who had thrived in the shadows, who had thrived in control. But now, the power had shifted. The walls he had built, the web of lies, had crumbled around him. The sudden realization of his exposure hit him harder than any confrontation he had ever faced. "Put it down," he said, trying to regain some semblance of authority. "This won't end well for you." But it was too late. The truth was already out there, unraveling at a speed no one could control. The detective's power had always come from the information he had control over the narrative, the ability to manipulate people's perceptions. But the moment he had been caught in his own web of lies, there was nothing left for him to hold on to. His face paled as he realized how deeply he had underestimated the people in front of him. "You're wrong," his mother said quietly, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something that resembled sorrow in her eyes. "This has been coming for a long time." There was a moment of hesitation, but then, without warning, his mother dropped the gun and took a step back. The detective blinked, confused, uncertain. But before he could react, she took out a small device from her jacket pocket, a tiny, unassuming flash drive, and tossed it to him. He caught it instinctively, the weight of it almost insignificant in his hands. The realization hit him all at once. It wasn't just a photo, a weapon, or a plan. The entire conspiracy had been documented. Every move he had made. Every secret he had kept. The flash drive wasn't just the end of the detective's empire. It was the start of a new beginning. "That's everything," she said softly, her voice steady despite the tension. "Every last detail. Your whole operation. It's all there." For a moment, the detective didn't know how to respond. He stared at the drive in his hands, eyes darting from the woman to the man sitting bound in the chair, and then back to the rest of the people in the room. The realization hit him with a crushing weight. The game was over. And no matter what he did next, there would be no escaping the truth. His brother, the one who had been so loyal, so fiercely protective of the empire they had built, now looked at him with something close to pity. "You played your hand too soon," he said. "And now it's over." The tension that had filled the room slowly dissipated, the air growing still. The brother who had been orchestrating this entire scheme, the one who had been the shadow behind it all, seemed less certain now. The control he once wielded was slipping away, and his body language betrayed the shift. He had been a puppet master, but now the strings were cut, and his power had vanished into thin air. But even as the walls around them came crumbling down, one thing was clear: there was still work to do. The detective, the brother, and all the others involved had to face the consequences. And it wouldn't be enough for them to just disappear or slip away into the night. The truth would be exposed, no matter what it took. "I'm done," the detective said, his voice barely above a whisper, as he backed away from the confrontation. "You don't know what you've started." But the words felt hollow. His confidence had been shattered. His empire, built on deceit, was now crumbling to dust. The man who had once held so much power, who had played a key role in the suffering of so many, now stood with nothing but the faintest echo of his former self. The world had moved on, and he was no longer relevant. As the dust settled, and the dust of secrets and lies began to lift, there was one last look shared between the man and his brother. It wasn't a look of vengeance, or triumph, or even defeat. It was a look of understanding, an acknowledgement of everything that had happened and everything that had been lost. The investigation had ended, the truth had been revealed, and the people who had been responsible for all the chaos had been exposed. But even with all the answers, even with the final pieces of the puzzle in place, there was still something more. Something deeper. The people in that room were not just players in a game of power and deception. They were survivors. They had fought for something more than justice or revenge. They had fought for truth, for their freedom, and for the people they loved. And in the end, it was their strength, their resilience, that had brought them through. As the final pieces of the story were written, there was one final reflection. The story of betrayal, deception, and lies had not only been a journey to uncover the truth but a journey to understanding the very nature of trust itself. People had fallen, others had risen. But at the end of the day, the most important thing was that they had taken control of their own stories. And as the sun rose over the city, casting light on the shadows that had held them captive for so long, they knew this was just the beginning. The journey wasn't over, it had only just begun.